Hey y'all, Austin Kleon here, and I am absolutely delighted to be here with Oliver Burkeman. Oliver wrote this wonderful book called 4,000 Weeks Time Management for Mortals, and I think it was one of the best. It came out last year, right, Oliver?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I just think it was one of the best books I read last year. Oliver wrote another book called The Antidote that I read in 2013 and had a huge impact on one of my books called Show Your Work. We'll talk about that later, but Oliver, thanks for doing this, and
Oh,
thank
it's
you
a big
for
pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
being here with me. I wanted to ask you first off, because the back of your book says, or in the bio, it says he lives in New York City. Is that still true? Where are you right now?
It isn't. I mean, at least for now, anyway. We're living in the North York Moors, which is a rural part of northern England. Uh, that's why it's 8 p.m. here, not 3 p.m. So that's why it's okay for me to be drinking beer in the middle
That's
of this conversation. I'm not doing that in the afternoon. So yeah, I don't. Who knows what the future holds? It's sort of provisional, but yeah, we're in the we're in the wilds instead of Brooklyn now.
I want to ask you, you, you are you still writing the column for the Guardian,
No,
or
I
is that in
wrapped
the
that up.
past now?
I wrapped that up year and a bit ago. So
Okay,
yeah.
so I wanted to ask you. This book is just, I want to ask you how a book comes together for you, because I
Painfully.
read this thing that Billy Collins, the poet, which of course we're talking about a different genre, but Billy Collins said, I don't write books, I write poems. And then when I have enough poems, I take it to my editor to see if there's enough for a book, which I thought was really great. Of course, that's poetry. But I wanted to ask you, you're someone who writes, so, you had the column for so long, and now you have the wonderful, if you're watching this, subscribe to Oliver's newsletter, The Imperfectionist, which I'm so jealous of that title. I love it. I wanted to ask you, like, how a book starts to come together for you, because you seem to be someone who is writing about this stuff all the time. How do you know when like a book is starting to gel or appear?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I have sort of worked out all the ideas I've ever written about in a book in public first. It's funny because through the columns, I mean, it's funny because I am the classic person who's sort of uneasy about the whole sharing my work as I go thing, and I like your philosophy of this is absolutely spot on and brilliant, but it doesn't come immediately naturally to me to sort of do it. And yet I've ended up doing it under the guise of journalism, right? I I get to think of each of those columns as a finished product that I didn't show my work for. But actually, what that aggregates to is that you're sort of experimenting, you're working things out, you're hearing from people, getting book recommendations and from readers and all sorts. It was an amazing context to do that for. Um, both times that a book sort of gelled, I guess it was just that pattern of seeing a sort of repeating underlying theme that just wouldn't go away, basically, and that sort of knitted together a huge amount of stuff. So in the case of The Antidote, it was like the downsides of conscious willed positive thinking approaches to happiness and the upsides of becoming more accommodating of negative emotions, uncertainty and failure and things like that. And in this case, really, I mean, another way of looking at these books, I would never say this in the book or on the cover, I guess, because it's not very commercially appealing, is they are just sort of like, this is kind of my life philosophy as far as I can figure it out, right? And then 10 years later, it's hopefully grown into a differently interesting one. I mean, no one would want to read a book called This Is My Life Philosophy, but I think it kind of, on some level, that is what I think maybe all of us are doing in some way or another when it comes to this genre of writing anyway, certainly.
They're incredibly philosophical. And, one of the things I wanted to ask you about self help, because I think one of the things that your books do really brilliantly is they sort of flirt with self help. They are anti self help, and yet they're sort of like fly, and they're almost like self-help without being self-help. And I feel very close to this too, because I feel like my books in a way are just my attempt to be like what you just said. Like, here's kind of my overall philosophy right now of how like art is made, or how
Mm.
to have a creative life or whatever. What was the first time you really grappled with self-help as a genre, and like what do you think about it, and how do you think about it in terms of like where your books land in the publishing industry?
Oh,
Or
I
do you
don't know.
not
I mean,
think
I guess
about
yeah. When I
it?
first started writing the column for the Guardian, I definitely, this was like what, 12 years ago now, something. I had a very sort of, I would say, borderline cynical attitude, that I was going to like mock this absurd genre. Um, and really, the story for me of writing that column was the story of becoming less cynical and more sincere as it went on, and as I got older, which I think is a thing as well. So it was fun to poke holes in bad self-help, of which there continues to be plenty. But it was more fun in a way to be what I felt was a bit provocative with my readers, the readers of the Guardian. The more controversial thought for them, I took it, was that there might be some really valuable things inside some of those books. And at the end of the day, this has been said many times, but self-help, there's no back in ancient philosophy, didn't distinguish between the therapeutic purpose of philosophy and the sort of analytical academic purpose. And I'm not a trained philosopher, so it's just what comes naturally to me when it comes to trying to help myself is to plunder from just everywhere, really. I think that the main thing I do is that sort of magpie approach to the source material, because there's some great stuff in some classic self-help books, and then there's some great stuff in Seneca, and even in Heidegger, if you can
If you can
get
get
to
through
it.
it.
And yeah, I don't think the urge to help oneself is something to be ashamed of. I think there's some pretty dodgy approaches to it that have been
True.
promulgated, but that no. So I mean, it was, I guess, one of the things that was happening as I was writing the column and writing for the first book, was becoming a little bit more willing to be open about the fact that I would quite like some help in certain ways. That there were unanswered questions that we all sort of have, I think, and that you don't need to pretend to be so cool as to not have those questions. It's all
Oh,
changed a lot, by the way, because now I think the discussion changed around me completely. Now there's nothing shameful about talking. I mean, it's very important that we destigmatize conversations about these things, but I sometimes feel like, how can you say they're still stigmatized? It's just like, it's 50%
right.
of social media. So that's much better than the alternative. And
Yeah.
so, it did change around me as well, the environment.
What's your reading life like? I mean, you described yourself just now as a magpie, and kind of this voracious, omnivorous person who takes things from omnivorous, uh takes things from a lot of different places. What's your reading life look like on a day-to-day basis? Like, how much do you read, and where do you read, and when do you read, and that kind of thing? Or does it vary?
Yeah, it does. And I struggle with it because I end up doing a lot of reading in sort of quick, um, plundering from places and quoting from people, and sort of doing a kind of instrumental reading that you end up having to do a lot of with this kind of work, I think. And I do get time to sit for an hour or two sometimes, but it's far too infrequent. So I end up reading in, maybe I shouldn't feel bad about this, I don't know, but I end up reading lots and lots of little bits of lots of sources. And I guess that's sort of folded into my day. I do try to sort of carve out, 3/4 of an hour sometimes to just sit in a chair and read. But that, as you know, parenting can get in the way of that kind of opportunity. So yeah, I end up reading a lot of like Winnie the Pooh as well,
Yeah.
aloud to my son, which is it's an interesting. Actually, a lot of that is an interesting experience too. I think we'll talk about that if you want. The big gap in my reading is I read all this kind of nonfiction, philosophy, academic stuff, psychology, more pop psychology for my work, I guess. And then if I get a chance to read when I'm like drifting off to sleep, I read spy fiction, basically, a detective fiction. And challenging contemporary literature just falls out of the picture completely. And I feel very bad about this because I know that I would benefit from it, but I don't see where in my life I read a good, new, serious novel. So that just never happens, basically.
Do you watch TV?
Little bit, yeah. Little bit.
Okay.
Not
I
a
feel
huge amount. I don't think I can save that time and turn that into novel reading time.
I feel like I feel like I get a lot of my sort of contemporary storytelling through television now, for better or
Right.
worse. I think a lot of the stories come that way.
Right.
And
That's fair enough.
also as a parent, so I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I just firmly believe that television is it's just the way to collapse at the end of the day. I use television in the way that people are supposed to, where
Right.
it's like
Yep.
I just want
Yep.
to turn my brain off at the end of the day. But let's talk about having a 5-year-old. What did becoming a parent? Let's try to pull it back to the book and talk a little bit about the book.
Sure.
What did becoming a parent do to your sense of time?
Uh, it had some significant impact. Yeah. I mean, the thing that always surprises me looking back at this is that I actually sold this book proposal prior to our son being born.
Okay.
And then there were like multiple years of deadline extensions because I was focused on other things. So I wasn't writing it the whole time. But I honestly don't quite understand how I could have had any of the thoughts that I put in that proposal, because they all became sort of 8,000 times more true through the experience of parenthood. I don't think that I know anything that doesn't apply about time. I mean, I don't think I know anything that doesn't apply to people who aren't parents. I'm always quite keen to make sure that I'm not just sort of talking at other parents on these kinds of topics. But it makes certain universal truths very, very, very hard to ignore.
Okay.
And one of those is just how limited and finite time is, just on the level of the day, right? I mean, you never have enough time to do everything, but you really don't have enough time to do everything when there's this kind of suddenly, like, fully at least a third of your discretionary time every day is just gone to those responsibilities. And then also this kind of point that I come back to again and again in the book about living entirely for the future, and how prone we are to instrumentalizing time such that we're always valuing the present moment only in terms of whether it's helping us get somewhere in the future. And parenthood dramatizes that massively, because on the one hand, yes, you really care about like putting the right things in place for your kids to be successful later on. But on the other hand, children, I guess especially very young children, change so fast that you can miss the actual experience of that relationship if you are completely focused on the future. So I write in the book about how at the very beginning of becoming a father, I did sort of try to import what was then still the remnants of my kind of classic productivity, efficiency, optimization mindset onto the job of parenting. And it was very useful and educational for me, and ultimately beneficial for my son, to realize how little that applies, right? How you can't do that, right? So it was I was glad to learn that then. Although I'm, challenged every day in one way or another in terms of, well, I had this plan, but can't go with that plan now because of, and in some ways actually it's just a sheer pleasure. But I do think that a friend of mine, Jonathan Rosen, who wrote a book called The Moves That Matter, which in which he makes this very astute point that actually it's kind of marriage that becomes an interesting challenge once you become a parent. Actually, lots and lots of hanging out with a 3-year-old is just fine. It's like
That's fine. Yes.
it's the complex world of a family and multiple adults that are that can be the place where you grow and learn the most, maybe sometimes.
I like that you said complexity, because there's a designer named Tibor Kalman who is married to Myra Kalman, the great illustrator, and he's in his book he talks about how he and Myra decided to increase the complexity of their lives by having children. And I've always loved that way of putting it. You know, I always feel like there's another quote that I read one time that was, you know, genius is very simple. It's ordinary life that's complex. You know, if you think about some of the, you know, genius is often about like, well, I just do this thing. I'm the great genius and I have my life is completely tuned towards doing this work. But then when you bring in ordinary life, whether it's the domestic life of the family or having a day job or whatever, that's very complex. And so I love that you use that word complex. I'm trying to think of an actual question for that. But
well, you go from two with one kid, you go from 2 to 6, right? In terms of number of directions of relationship that are going, and then it must be I'm not good at powers, but anyway, if you've got 2 kids, it gets very much harder, very quick, much more quick.
So I do a little routine this way. So there's you, right? And you exist and you have all sorts of unseen connections to people in the world. But when it's just you and you're single, that's one, you know, it's really just you have to worry about. And then, you know, when you decide to get married, you're linked to this person, and this line is a relationship that you have to worry about right now. So there's like already it's a little bit more complex. You add a third person into that, and all of a sudden you've got you've got the whole, but then there's more lines. Right, there's 3 lines to worry about, and then when you add a fourth person,
suddenly
this is why you just want to stick with one kid. You know, this is what people mean when they say it's exponential. All of a sudden, you've got all these relationships that you're working on in the family. So I always feel like the complexity thing. When people ask me, like, "Well, how's your life changed when you have kids?" Complicated. It's just more complex. I wanted to ask you about a very specific book dealing with kids. I wanted to ask you about the book "More Work for Mother." Because I think this is a book that could really speak to. Could you just explain really quickly what More Work for Mother is?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really only, I have read the whole thing, but I'm really only deeply familiar with one particular argument in it, so I don't want to sort of cheapen the work. It's a big work of social history and labor history by a historian called Ruth Schwartz Cowan. And the subtitle is something like "Ironies of Household Something in the Something." The point that I love anyway from this book is that it's an examination of the impact of so-called labor-saving devices on the work of people doing housework, basically housewives and domestic servants, speaking in terms of how it actually was at the dawn of the 20th century, and it's a sort of, it's an analysis of the way in which this is the point that I'm sort of drawing from it, but is the ways in which these devices that had in them the potential to save time, that's obviously the whole point, right? That's why you have a vacuum cleaner or a washing machine, didn't do that essentially because societal and cultural expectations of cleanliness just rose to offset the benefits. So you went from a situation where, you know, it was pretty hard to keep clothes clean. Nobody expected a shirt to be clean after the first wearing for at least a week or 2 or something, to this point where you can have shirts be completely clean around the collar whenever they're being worn. At that point, all these sort of cultural values start emerging. And this kind of celebration of the role of the domestic sphere and the role of the homemaker and all the rest of it, that then sort of require you, if you're if you're someone doing the housework, and the cleaning and the washing, to reach a higher standard than before. So there's actually no labor saved at all. And in my book, I talk about how this is a sort of a paradigm for all sorts of other areas in which efficiency does not bring saved time.
I just love that. First of all, my wife did a lot of science and technology studies when she was in architecture school, so we had that
Right.
book on the
It's that field.
shelf,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and it's always been a mind blower for me. And I love the point is that as we think we're people ask me all the time, like, well, what gadgets, what apps do you use to, like, keep track of things and stuff? And
Yeah.
I'm like, you're looking at it, buddy. Like, pen and paper, it's the technology that still does it for me, because as we add these devices that are supposed to save us all this time, we lose something, to it. And I just think that's such a beautiful point in your book. I wanted to, speaking of time, I wanted to ask you how you would. There's a question that people always ask me in Q&A,
Mhm.
and I want to ask you this question because I think it cuts right to the heart of your book, and I want to hear how you answer.
I'm
I
ready.
always I always love this question because people say to me, they say, "I have all these ideas and all these things I want to do. How do you choose which one to do?"
Mhm.
And usually I say, "Well, just pick one and give your other ideas to me, and I'll, but because I always feel like the opposite. I always feel like I'm looking for that one good idea to actually work on.
Yeah. Right.
But
Right. Right.
but I think this cuts right to the heart of your book because I think that I would love to hear how you answer that question. Like, how do I choose what to work on? I have all these things I want to do. Like, how do I choose what to work on?
Yeah. I mean, I I think that I continue to experience a version of this. It's not that I have like 50 brilliant ideas for fantastic books, but it is that I have 50 things on my list that feel like they really need doing today,
Right.
and I'm not going to get them all done. I'm not going to get more than 3 of them done probably on a given, so I mean, I guess the main point that I always come back to and try to push people back to is because it's very closely connected to the main thesis of my book, I suppose, is is that we're always in this situation of having um, less time than there are things to fill the time with. We're always in the situation of having more ideas than we'll be able to execute, or more felt obligations than we're able to fulfill. Anything. It doesn't have to be like fun things like creative ideas. It could be bad things like sort of duties and demands. So there's always this mismatch, and therefore any sort of attempt in you or time management system that promises to help you find time for it all is just bogus. It's not going to happen. Huge numbers of your wonderful creative ideas are going to get left by the wayside, not because, and that's not a problem, that's just like that's built into the situation of getting anything done. So I am saying, like, so that my answer to that question is like, it doesn't matter, just pick one. But I do think it's useful to see why, to me anyway, it just doesn't matter and you should pick one. The reason is because it's just a given that you're going to be neglecting good things in order to focus on one good thing, right? That sort of that
Yeah.
it's not that there isn't some clever way that you can somehow figure out that 49 of these 50 ideas were actually bullshit and you only need to focus on the one good one. No, there's going to be 10 good ones there. And plus you don't know, right? Plus you have no
Yeah.
idea of knowing
Yeah.
which one was going to pan out. There's a lovely there's a paradox that you must have come across called, or may have come across, called Fredkin's paradox, which basically just makes this observation that if we have a dilemma and two paths seem equally worth pursuing, or two things to do seem equally valuable, and we have to choose one, that's a situation where humans tend to feel very conflicted and like the stakes are very high. But if it's true that they're both very, very worthwhile things to do, the stakes are actually incredibly low, and
Right.
it cannot matter very much which you choose. So I think it is really useful to sort of get a sense of that situation that we're in. Like, yeah, you're never gonna know that you picked the right path, and there are always going to be 50 great things in the path you didn't take, and all of that is built in. That ship has sailed, and I find
Right.
that very liberating because then you're just like, okay, just intuition, whatever.
It was Robert Frost's birthday a couple of days ago, and so I was rereading some of his poems, and of course, his most famous one is
Yeah.
the Road Less Traveled. And I I
The
think
Road
that
Not
poem,
Taken.
The Road
The
Not
Road Less
Taken,
Traveled is a great self-help book. But
that's a
anyway,
self-help
both
book.
lines come
And
from the poem. Carry on. Yeah.
see, you got me. So that's a really interesting thing. That is really the heart of what I was about to bring up, which is that poem has been so misunderstood as a comment on nonconformity of,
Mm,
oh, I took the road less traveled. No, actually it's the road not taken. And the really smart readings of that poem that I've read are that kind of idea that, look, you're always going to look back and say, oh, I didn't take that one,
yeah.
and kind of
Yeah.
puff yourself up about. So
Yeah.
I think it's a much darker and more interesting reading
Have you
of
read?
that poem.
Have you got the David Orr book?
That's the
About
one
it?
I'm
Yeah.
thinking
Yeah.
about. I
So
forget the
interesting.
name of it though. What's the
It's called. I
title of
think
that
it's
book?
called The Road Not Taken.
The Road Not
Finding
Taken. Yeah.
America in the poem most
Yeah.
that people misunderstand, or something like that. Right, because the firstly, there's all these weird clues. Like he says he took the road less traveled, but then he also says they're rough. They look roughly traveled the same. So like, what's that about? And
Yeah.
then secondly, he arguably seems to be mocking himself, the future version of himself, saying like, "Oh yeah, ages and ages hence, I will be claiming that I
Exactly.
made the nonconformist route, but I won't have any way of knowing. Who knows?"
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you're right. I think
I just think
it's
it's
a
so
very, very
much.
interesting poem on a closer inspection.
So anyone who's watching, all the Robert Frost stuff is online. So just look up The Road Not Taken and reread it a couple of times because it's very deep. Speaking of Robert Frost, I want to ask you. So you're someone who's married to an American. You spent a lot of time in the U.S. I wanted to ask you about hobbies because Orwell. We both, the two of us, not me and Orwell, but me and you, we are big proponents of good old fashioned hobbies. This is
Mhm.
something I've been pushing people for the past couple of years. Is like, you need a hobby, particularly creative people, because
Right.
creative people have a bad habit of turning their hobbies into their breadwinning.
Yeah.
So, which always means that you have to get another hobby. You say
Yes.
this beautiful thing. The thing I love in the book that you say is that, a hobby probably should be embarrassing. You should probably be a little bit embarrassed by your hobby because that means that it's, you feel like it's worthless enough that it's a real hobby, that it's there for its own doing. I wanted to ask you if you see any cultural difference in the way that British people approach hobbies versus American people, because there's a great Orwell. Orwell has this great essay where he talks about how he thinks that the British penchant for like individual hobbies like
Yeah.
gardening or going to the pub, like that was like a shored up thing against fascism. And then the actor Mackenzie Crook, who did the
Mhm.
show Detectorists, about metal detectorists, he said that he felt like in his experience that the British are better at hobbies. How do you feel about this? Like, what do you think it is about Americans? Do you think Americans are uniquely bad at hobbies, or do you reject that notion? Or
Uh,
why could it be?
I mean, the Orwell stuff. I dimly am familiar with that essay, the relationship between that kind of localized interest and how that actually creates a kind of social fabric that's quite durable against outside threats. But
Yeah.
I mean, so it's my sort of observations are skewed by the fact that I haven't just moved from Brooklyn from the US back to the UK, but from Brooklyn to rural Northern England. It's been a while since I was living in a city in the UK, so it may well be that there are certain lifestyle differences that come there as well. I I do think that wherever anything can be attributed to late capitalism, it's going to be a bit worse and a bit more extreme in the US than the UK. Only a
That's
bit. We're
yeah.
not many
But
years
a
behind you, but
little bit.
just a little bit. So my argument in the book, yeah, is that one of the reasons that hobbies feel embarrassing is that they do sort of tend to oppose the overall cultural pressure to use time in a quote useful, productive way. That's why it's really cool to have a side hustle, but really
Right.
uncool to have a hobby, because a side
Yeah.
hustle is a hobby that you're going to make some money out of.
That's right.
And yeah, I mean, you can really overstate the point about how Americans are incredibly instrumental about making profit out of things and British people aren't. That is like, that's not true. It's not that
Not
extreme.
true.
But
Okay,
there is that little edge that has to do with all sorts of deep cultural issues about, America being a very, I think, a very young country in its sort of modern form, and possibly the sort of social safety nets even in Britain, not that there's much of it left, but that do protect a bit of leisure time in a way that isn't so protected in a sort of hyper competitive one person for themselves culture like America is a bit more. So yeah, I think there's a bit of that. I think there's a bit of a difference. I have to say also, I think there may be some generational things going on. Every so often I encounter tales of people like much younger than me, people in their 20s or something, who really are like doing hobbyist things like quite seriously, and I'm like, I wonder if that's some kind of threshold has been crossed where people are, where it's where that's something you're going to be more open to if you're not a Gen Xer.
I hope so.
So who
I
knows?
hope maybe the youth will find the real hobbies. I know we're a little over time, but you've said I can keep going if you're having fun. So
Yeah, I'm having fun. Got to finish my beer as well. So.
Yeah, okay. So once the beer is done, then we'll quit.
You don't want me on a second beer, I'm telling you.
That's right. You don't want me on the second beer. I wanted to ask you, so there's a lot of, you dip into a lot of different religious backgrounds for the book. There's like the sort of Taoist approach to time and that it's flowing and ever changing. There's kind of the Buddhist attitude that, our attention forms our experience, and then there's there's a lot of really good stuff in the book about, the Judaism's architecture of time
Mhm.
and the Sabbath. I wanted to ask you a little bit about what your own religious background is, and whether you practice any kind of religion now.
Uh, yeah, it's such a sort of live issue for me. The answer is kind of no, but I'm super religion curious. There needs to be a word for that.
Yeah.
I'm yeah. So I'm Jewish on my father's side, which makes me not Jewish apparently, and there was no Judaism in my upbringing. Those
Okay.
so like 95% of the Jewish religious things I've ever done, I did after moving to New York as an adult. But if I was raised anything, I was raised as a Quaker. My parents are
Oh,
practicing Quakers, which is I'm very grateful for that
yeah.
background in lots of ways. But it is kind of quite not very religious in a way, right? There's a sense of the rhythms of religion, perhaps, and of the
Yeah.
importance of the questions that religion addresses. But I think a good chunk of Quakers, including the ones who raised me, are probably essentially atheists. So I don't know that it really counts in certain ways. I'm now living in a part of the world that has roots to like the links to early Christianity are like off the charts here. I can walk like 15 minutes down the road, and there's a church that has aspects of it dating back to like the 7th century.
Wow.
This stuff is like old. Even
Old.
to a British person, it seems old.
Yeah.
Americans are like,
Yeah. Like
what? It's
nothing's old over
120
here.
years.
Yeah.
I'm kidding, but
No, it's
so
true.
yeah. So I've had some really interesting feedback from this book from Christian people, basically from sort of Protestant people who write and think about that stuff, both positive and to a certain extent critical, because I guess if you're fully signed up to that, then there's a sense in which we're not mortals, and
Right.
our time is not finite. But no, I'm just sort of, it's yeah, ask me again in a year when I've suddenly converted to Catholicism or something. I mean, anything
Yeah.
could happen, I feel, at the moment.
A lot of my Jewish friends are like, "You're Jewish, but you should convert." You know, So I'm always, I'm very curious too. I mean, I grew up very devout. Like I grew up Methodist
Right.
in here, and but very very, and I have, that's in my background. My parents still go to church, and And I find that for me, the writing and the art has sort of taken a lot of the place of the 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 ritual, the devotion, the daily devotional, that kind of rhythm. A lot of that comes in the work now. And of course, I just read The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, in which
Yeah.
he's very much like, it's never enough. It won't be enough for you.
No, I think that, I mean, the communal and collective aspect, I don't lack that entirely in my life, thankfully, due to,
Yeah.
family and friends and the rhythms of various things. But I think that the communal aspect of that
Yes.
is that's the
Well,
thing.
you've
Yeah.
spoken of singing in the choir. Do you still sing in the choir ever? Or, I mean,
Uh,
COVID kind of made
well,
that.
when COVID came along, it suddenly became the most dangerous thing you could possibly do.
Right.
And so our choir in Brooklyn closed for a while. It's since I think restarted, but we've left.
Yeah.
So I'm not currently singing in a choir. I think if I was wanting to do that right round here, it probably the closest thing would be to start going to church services more and doing that. So
Yeah.
maybe that's my next step.
Maybe. What do you what do you say to people who just outright say, this is too depressing for me? I just can't think about your book's too depressed. Like I feel that particularly there's a strain of that death is just, I can't think about 4,000 weeks. Like I'm too depressed. Like that's too
Yeah.
depressing. What do you say? What's the response? Do you have one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that response, it's slightly more often expressed as kind of terror and horror, and therefore, why would you want to read a book with that title? And I'm aware
Uh,
it was a relatively high stakes choice because it is an alarming title or maybe depressing to people. My response is I don't tell them please read the book because that seems kind of self-absorbed. But what I want to say is please read the book because I don't think that the consequences of following this argument through are depressing at all, right?
I
I mean,
agree.
this isn't a book about death and dying. It isn't a book about death in that sense. And I'm not sure I have reached any great level of, equanimity about that fact when it comes to, myself or my loved ones. But it's just about this one major consequence of the fact that we do die, which is the finite nature of the time that we have. And I mean, probably I'll do the very short version, but I think ultimately, if you go all the way into that, that is a relief. That is a liberation. It is not a cause of stress. Stress is the reaction that says, I've got a very little time and I've still got to somehow do something with it that is more than can be done in a life. Like I've got to somehow go down in history. I've got to somehow manage to do everything or fulfill all my ambitions. Actually, if you really take on board the message of finitude, it's like, well, all you can do is just use the time you have to do a few things that matter. Like the pressure is off in a fundamental way. I don't mean it makes death and dying somehow no problem, but like we are so limited in the time that we have and the control that we have that it frees you from the burden of that obligation to somehow do uh, a sort of overwhelming amount or to guarantee your success in anything that you do. And it just returns you to this kind of, here we are. There are a few things that matter to me, and I can use the time I have to do a few of those things. So I think ultimately it's a burden lifted. I agree that the title doesn't give that impression.
I think it's a marvelous book. It's for anyone tuning in, it's 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. It's about the things that matter. It's about establishing your values around time and what you do with your time here. I actually heard from a reader, Oliver, who just passed her 4,000 week and read the book and was quite actually. I think she was motivated by it. What
I
she's
hope
going to
that a
do with
person in
her
that
80s.
situation thinks, great, it's all gravy now, right? It's all
Oh,
surplus.
gravy!
It's
I got
brilliant.
my
I can just
stuff.
do, you're right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I feel like that's a good note for us to end on. So the book is 4,000 Weeks. The thing I would love for you to do, everyone who's watching, is I would like you to go to Oliver's website and sign up for The Imperfectionist, which is Oliver's newsletter. It is wonderful. There's a great story of Brad Pitt working with Terrence Malick, and someone said, "Oh, he's such a perfectionist," and Brad Pitt said, "Actually, he's an imperfectionist. He's looking for these little
I did not know
moments
that.
Yeah,
Okay,
so I
wow.
love the title, and I'm very jealous of it. So it's The Imperfectionist. Look that up online and follow Oliver's newsletter and get 4,000 Weeks, and also check out The Antidote. I have to tell you, Oliver, The Antidote was a huge when I found myself, it's not about me, but when Steal Like an Artist ended up on the self-help shelf, I was sort of, that was unanticipated, for me, and reading The Antidote at that particular time, I just felt like, well, here's someone who's playing with this in this very interesting way, and it just really gave me a sense of possibilities. And so I just wanted to end by thanking you for your work and your writing. You've been a big inspiration for me, so thank you.
Thank you so much. The fandom is mutual, so thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure and delight. Oliver Burkeman, everyone, check it out, 4,000 Weeks, and I'll see y'all later.
Thanks, everyone.